A very good evening to all of you. First, I must apologize, I'm going to disappoint you. I seldom use the word 4.0 because I don't really fully understand what it means yet. But having said that, I thought tonight, thank you for your invite. I will set the context for tonight's discussion and sharing by first setting out what I see as the two biggest challenges for the global system in the coming years: connectivity and coherence in governance. Let me set everybody thinking with two propositions. First, connectivity. The proposition is this: global connectivity has uplifted the world's economic development for the past few decades, enabling improvements to the lives of millions of people. But global connectivity is now under stress. If global connectivity regresses, the world will move towards a much lower growth trajectory, threatening the continued progress, threatening the economic progress of millions. We risk repeating what happened in the 1920s, where we started off with a recession, moving into the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, in the spirit of 4.0, connectivity today is no longer just about trade connectivity in the physical dimensions of air, land, and sea. It must also encompass the non-physical dimensions of data, finance, talent, technology, and regulatory systems. But first, why and how did we end up in the current situation where trade and technologies are seen more as challenges rather than opportunities? The flow of trade and exchange of ideas allowed our production and distribution systems to be optimized at the global level. A fragmented global system means that all of us sub-optimize at the local or regional level. But a global system requires all of us to play our part to uphold and update the rules. It also requires every country to master its political will and resources to help its businesses and workers make the consequential adjustment that comes with trade and technological changes. The fruits of trade must not only be distributed, it must be mastered to help businesses and workers disrupted to keep pace, thereby enabling businesses and workers to embrace changes and seize the new opportunities in a positive, virtuous cycle. On the other hand, failure to uphold our individual responsibilities to the global system through beggar-thy-neighbor policies, adoption of politically expedient policies for short-term or partisan gains, and failure to use the gains from trade to help businesses and workers adapt and adjust will all contribute to the local pushback against trade and technology with global consequences. Connectivity, once broken, will lead us down a slippery downhill slope. Now let me move on to the second proposition for tonight. The world increasingly need but lack coherence in governance, regardless of the diverse political models that we have. The greater the lack of coherence and confidence at the domestic level in the respective economies, especially within the major ones, the higher our chances of incoherence at the global level. On the other hand, there is also a feedback loop from the global to the local. The greater the incoherence at the global level, the more emboldened the cause at the domestic level for partisan and short-term interests to precede any international considerations. Again, why and how did we get here? Policy making in too many political systems are fractured today by sectorial, partisan, and short-term political interests with little coherence and with even less weight given to the long-term interests of our people and system. One contributing factor will be the increasing ability for opportunist politicians to narrowcast their appeal through diverse channels without the need to bring people together towards the common good. A second contributing factor will be the acceleration of political cycles contributed by the demand for quick fixes and results. Sometimes, political leaders may feel like they are English Premier League managers or CEOs trying to meet their quarterly reporting targets, where their survival is constantly threatened by fickle fans and inconsistent results. Paradoxically, the more we spend trying to put out the immediate short-term fires, the less attention we pay to the long-term structural issues. And consequently, the more fires we have to fight in the longer term. In extremis, we may all end up spending our time fighting the short-term local fires rather than thinking of how to prevent more fires from happening in the future. Ultimately, there is no easy cure. It boils down to leadership. Will there be more politicians or will there be more political leaders? Politicians are those who believe that their job is only to reflect the ground desire, or as someone put it in a pithy manner, see where the crowd is running, sprint ahead, and shout, "Follow me." Political leaders, on the other hand, must be upfront with their people on both the long and short-term goals, both the opportunities and constraints, and the trade-offs that need courage and leadership to execute. That we are all accountable, not just to this generation, but to the many that will come after. And let me say that trade-offs is different from pork barrel politics, where everyone gets something as compromise. Policy trade-offs means choosing competing but internally coherent paths, and having done so, it means carrying the ground to assure all that the chosen path best optimizes the overall welfare of our people, and that we have a plan to share the gains fairly with all, including those who have sacrificed their personal gains for the greater good. Now let me conclude by bringing these two hypotheses together, and then we can have a discussion. Ultimately, connectivity at the global level and coherence at the domestic level have positive feedback loops with one another. A positive feedback loop means that the two can be either a virtuous positive cycle or a vicious negative cycle, but always self-reinforcing one another. May we have the wisdom to distinguish between the two. May we have the courage to choose the correct path, such that we do not regress back to where we were 100 years ago. And I will stop here, and I'll be happy to hear your views and continue the discussion. That while we may strive towards technology 4.0, connectivity 4.0, but it is high time for us to make sure that we move past beyond coherence at the governance level 1.0. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Chun. May I now invite Piyush Gupta, CEO of the DBS Group and one of our very own alumni, to come on stage. He'll be engaging in a dialogue with the minister.
Minister, thank you very much for those comments, and actually thank you for spending the evening with us. Some of your comments were enlightening, and frankly, your first comments around connectivity resonate a little bit with the comments that the High Commissioner made in the morning. So while I wait for questions from the floor on Pigeonhole, I'm going to start us off over there. So I think you pithily said connectivity has been a huge positive for the world. Certainly, in the past, the trade connectivity, but going forward, all kinds of connectivity. Javed this morning spoke about a potential future where geopolitics is changing. So we're moving beyond a Cold War world, a unipolar world, to what he thought would likely be a multipolar world. So many powers and many subregions all having spheres of influence. And in that world, he actually posited that you would see shifting alliances. So people would be issues-based in terms of who they reach out to, as opposed to ideology-based. There's another possibility that you do wind up with a fragmented world, a China-led world, maybe not just internet world, but China-led world and the Western-led world. If you wind up in the situation where connectivity starts breaking down, as opposed to the more positive path that you suggest, how does a country like Singapore play? It's not easy for us as a small red dot. We've benefited from being able to align ourselves to the tides of progression. But in a fragmented world, in a non-connected world, how would Singapore play a role, and what would Singapore's future look like?
The survival of Singapore, or the fundamentals of Singapore's survival has never changed. For us to survive and to thrive, we need to be connected to the different parts of the world, because the world is our hinterland. In a situation where the world breaks up into different blocks or fragment, bifurcate, whatever we might call it, our challenge is to make sure that we can connect to the different parts without choosing sides. And there's a very simple Chinese phrase that says that if you ever choose sides, you will become irrelevant. But if you are irrelevant, you will inevitably have to choose sides. So be it on the geopolitical front, be it on the technological front, on the economic front, and so forth, the goal of Singapore and our aim is to make sure that we can be relevant to all different parties across the world in order to entrench our value to the world. And how do we do that? We can only do that if we spend enough time, effort to understand the different parts of the world, ask ourselves the very fundamental questions: what are people's interests? What are our interests? How do we reconcile the competing interests, and how do we play a useful role? So just as an example now, the US may be having some issues with China at this point in time, but that doesn't mean that the US or China have problems with Singapore. And in fact, at this point in time, Singapore can continue to value add to the perspective of both US and China. And that is what we mean by being able to value add, remain relevant, and interoperate across different parts of the world. The other part of Piyush's question is this. If even in the event where we end up with a multipolar world, the question is, how do we minimize the chances of conflicts, be it on the economic front or the military front? And the only way that we can minimize the conflict is if different parties, different blocs, see an interdependence with one another. Interdependence rather than independence. When the world is more interdependent, the world is more connected, the smaller the chances of conflicts. So if you look at the financial markets today, if the US and the Chinese markets continue to be interdependent, then the risk of a conflict, the risk of a currency war, and so forth becomes diminished. But on the other hand, when the world fragments, and if different blocs see their own interests as independent rather than interdependent, then we will run the great risk that there will be conflicts of all kinds.
So I want to refer to the second part of your thing, the coherence in governance issue. One of the other things that's happening in recent times, of course, is a large part of the agenda, not just President Trump, but Brexit, other issues around the world, seem to be anchored on identity and a greater sense of identity-based politics as opposed to issues-based politics. And that's driving this problem at a national level. It's manifesting itself at a global level. You define it as a shift away from a rules-based system. One of the problems seems to be that the rules-based system was architected post-Second World War, Bretton Woods, etc., by Western liberal democratic powers dominated by the US. Today, with identity-based issues in their own economies, in their own countries, they're taking a step back from rules-based politics. The question then is, who establishes a new set of rules-based ideology? Is China up to it? Are other countries in the world able to do it? And if you don't wind up creating a rules-based order, then does that spill over, to your point, to the problems of connectivity?
Yes, I think they are all related. But let me first address the issue of why are we where we are. The pressures to change, the pressures to evolve is tremendous, especially with globalization and trade. The necessary adjustment in each society cannot be underestimated. When a society is unable to adjust or help its people and businesses adapt, there is great temptation to revert to the issues to the tribal instincts, race, language, religion. Because human by nature are quite tribal, despite Industry 4.0, Technology 4.0. There is something very primordial about us. But this is where you see the difference between politicians and political leaders. Politicians, especially the populist ones, that want to play on the fears and the primordial fears of the people in times of great pressure, will always use race, language, religion, tribal instincts to appeal. And that's why many societies begin to fracture. They revert to what they are comfortable with what you call identity politics. But the question is, how do we transcend this? And the only way to do so is if nation-states are able to master their political will and resources to help everyone make those necessary adjustments. In Singapore, it's enshrined in our pledge, our national pledge, regardless of race, language, and religion. It is enshrined in the pledge precisely because we understand how unnatural it is to build a nation-state, a young nation-state, regardless of race, language, and religion, because that is not necessarily the norm in most societies. But to do that, it takes political leadership. It takes political courage to say that we are all citizens of the same country, regardless of race, language, religion, ancestry, connections, and so forth. But this is not so evident in different parts of the world. Many politicians succumb to the temptation to use identity politics to deflect the need to help their people and businesses adjust. As the saying goes, it's always easy to tell the crowd that if we shut the gates, keep out the barbarians, we will live happily ever after. It is much more difficult to be upfront with our people and say that the world has changed and the world will continue to change, and let's make the necessary adjustment to keep pace with it. That there will be pain, there will be difficulties, but we will do this together as one people. Not many countries have arrived at this point, but that will distinguish the countries. But that will distinguish the countries that will continue to excel, united as one people, from those that will fragment. So this is a very difficult part of the political equation. And there is a feedback loop to the second part, which you mentioned. Then what do we do at the global system? The global system, as envisaged post-World War II, be it the Bretton Woods system and so forth, is not and should not be a static system. It will have to constantly keep pace with the changes and the context of the global economy. So what is the biggest change since World War II? If immediately post-World War II, there were a few dominant powers, America, the Soviet Union, and we ended up with the Cold War and the bipolar system. Post-1990, there were some mistaken euphoric sentiments that this will be a unipolar world where only the US will be the only superpower. But what has changed most recently is just on the economic front. China has grown tremendously over the last 30, 40 years ever since its opening up. And it will continue to do so. Not necessarily on a straight line trajectory, and I don't think it will be a straight line trajectory, but it will continue to evolve and grow. And the question is, in a bipolar, multipolar world, how will the leaders of these various economic blocs come together to design, update the global rule-based order? It is not a responsibility of only the US or the Chinese, but it is a collective responsibility for all of us. And that requires political courage. It requires the US and the Chinese and the other political blocs to be internally coherent and consistent for them to have the confidence to deal with each other as equals. But a regional or a global system cannot come about if each and every of the major countries have their own internal contradictions which they have not yet been able to resolve. So that is the moment that we are in now, and that is why the world is adjusting to this new phase as to how do we continue to evolve the global trading rules, taking into account the current context. But having said that, it is not all just playing defensive of trying to update the current global trading system for products and services. One of the biggest opportunities in tomorrow's economy is whether we can bring about a more integrated digital economy. And this is the reason why Singapore has been at the forefront to urge all like-minded countries and all like-minded companies, corporations, to join hands in this. The next lap of our economic competitiveness and the global prosperity will very much depend on whether the world will come together in a more integrated fashion led by the digital economy. Today, this morning, in your many sessions, be it hearing from Jessica from Ping An and so forth, you will know how vital it is that we integrate the global digital economy to allow the flow of data across borders in order to produce new products and services in service of mankind. But today, we also risk a fragmented global digital architecture, where some countries are tempted to use its size and power to fragment, isolate themselves from the rest. But this is the biggest challenge. If we think that Industry 4.0 is going to give us greater opportunities to optimize the global production processes and supply chains as one, then the flow, the free flow, the secure flow of data across border will be inevitable. So without that, it is hard for us to imagine us being to realize Industry 4.0. So our proposition is this. The world is at a crossroad. We have to decide whether we will press on with integration or will we succumb to the temptations to fragment, isolate ourselves from the forces, from the global forces.
Well, thank you. Minister, I have a few questions on Singapore economy and so on, and I will get to them in a bit, but I just want to circle back on a variant of the theme of identity politics. I have a question here, the number most voted question. You've talked about the importance of attracting top talent into Singapore, so which areas do you see as strategic? But I'm going to spin that question a little bit and take it back to the question of identity. So in the 2011 elections and the aftermath of that, there was obviously a lot of concern about whether a lot of foreign migration, immigration, was putting pressure on the Singaporean identity, certainly from the population at large. The next election saw that the government had actually very smartly and carefully addressed many of the concerns, so it seemed to be less of an issue. As you think forward to the Singapore future, how do you see the Singapore identity evolving? What do you see the role of a new wave of talent, but also therefore migrant population in this evolving Singapore identity? And is that something that we have got the arms around sufficiently at this stage?
So there are two parts to the question. What defines the Singapore identity? And the other part of the question is, what's Singapore's talent policy? Let me first touch on the Singapore identity. Singapore is one of those few countries in the world where we do not have sufficient history We are a young nation. Most countries with sufficient history will tend to define their identity on a backward-looking methodology. Most countries define their identity on the basis of race, language, religion, ancestry, that we all come from the same geographical area, and so forth. But in Singapore, because we don't have enough history, we don't have this privilege. So instead, we define our identity as a forward-looking identity. An identity based on a set of values: meritocracy, incorruptibility, multiracialism. That's how we have defined our identity. And if you ask me, I think it's a more powerful way to define a national identity than just a backward-looking identity. So multiracialism, incorruptibility, meritocracy, that defines Singaporean. Now, that comes to our policy of growing our best and brightest, connecting our best and brightest with the rest of the world, and so forth. As I said in my recent speech at the A-Star Scholarship Ceremony, we have a 5-pronged talent strategy. Because Singapore never believed that we can compete on the basis of just 3.5 million Singaporeans. I always have a vision that while we may be 3.5 million Singaporeans or 3 million Singaporean families, we can have 30 million Singaporean friends and 300 million Singaporean fans. And that is, if you like, our vision of a global diaspora, a global Singapore diaspora. Now, how do we do that? For any country, the first strategy in talent is to make sure that you up the average for everyone. Up the average for everyone. And we have done reasonably well by making sure that our schools produce good students that are competent in their respective fields. The second strategy is to make sure that our best and brightest are given the best opportunities to fulfill their potential. We send them all over the world to learn from others and bring home the best ideas to contribute to Singapore. Having done that, then the third is to make sure that regardless of whether others come to Singapore, we must connect to the rest of the talent network across the globe. And that is why we have our Global Innovation Alliance partnering cities all across the world, from the Silicon Valley to the M4 corridor to the Tel Aviv of the world. Then the fourth thing we do is to make sure that we welcome those people who want to come to work in Singapore and partner Singaporeans to bring us to the next higher plane. And we will continue to do that. We have done that, and we will continue to do that. But having said that, that is an increasingly difficult task. Today, the war for talent, the war for global talent, is indeed global. No country in the world can ever claim that they have enough of the very best. The question is, how do we remain an attractive location for people to still want to come and partner fellow Singaporeans in our quest to reach the next higher level? Last but not least, regardless of what we do, the Asia-Pacific, especially ASEAN, will be our hinterland. And we want to make sure that the talent in this part of the world continue to see Singapore as an attractive springboard for them to reach out to the world, for them to connect to the world through Singapore. So it's a multi-pronged strategy to make sure that we remain connected with the rest of the world, and that's why I talk about the connectivity of talent and ideas. We will never be isolated from the rest of the world, because for a small city-state to defy the odds of history without a hinterland, the world must be our hinterland. The world must be our hinterland not just in terms of trade and technology, but also in terms of talent and ideas. And we will continue to make sure that Singapore remain an open and inclusive society for all. And that's how we will continue our journey.
Thank you, Minister. I have a couple of questions on economics. There are a couple which are more short-term. So, given the global recession looming large on the horizon, what is Singapore's plan to ride through the storm? And I think another one which is, well, essentially the issues, I lost the question here, but what is plan B for Singapore if global trade really comes down in the short term? So I think short-term questions. The headwinds, our second quarter GDP was weak. MTI's projection for full year is at roughly 0.5. We have 5 consecutive months of negative exports, so short term. The other question to this is slightly longer term. Our model is in the past been structured on being able to first attract the multinationals in, then build large domestic companies, but essentially be able to create manufacturing, financial services, trade, etc. model. In your view, as you think about the future of Singapore at MTI, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, what is your notion of an economic model for Singapore? Is it more of the same, or do we need to do something different?
Okay, so let me deal with the first part of the question, which is what about the short and the long-term challenges? Now, in Singapore, we do not look at it in that perspective of what are the short-term things that we do and what are the long-term things that we do. But actually, the two are related and intertwined. Whatever we do for the short term must also fit into the long term. So yes, in the next 1-2 quarters, every one of us, not just in Singapore but elsewhere, do expect headwinds from the global uncertainties. And over the last couple of weeks, the downside risk to the global economy has increased. Be it the US resumption of its tariff against China and China's promise to retaliate, the situation between Japan and Korea, the situation in Hong Kong, the unfinished business of Brexit, and so forth. These are all the downside risks that we are familiar with. But having said that, in Singapore, the short-term downturn is actually very much led by the global electronics sector, spilling over to the precision engineering sector and wholesale trade. And there is another effect, which is that the global investor confidence and global consumer confidence has come down over the last few quarters. In simple terms, people have money, but people are more cautious about spending the money, and you see that in the retail trade as well. So these are short-term factors that we have to deal with. But on the longer term, we are quietly confident because our investment pipeline remains robust. And if you look at the publicly announced investment over these last 6 months of the year, we are quietly confident that we are on the correct trajectory. We do not compete for all kinds of investment, and certainly not for many of the investment that might be relocating out of China because of the US and China trade conflict. But on the other hand, you will notice that many of our recent investments will be in the areas of high tech, high intellectual property content, those that rely on very secure data networks, those that require superior connectivity. These are the long-term strengths of Singapore, and we will play to our strengths. So we will continue to make sure that we remain a stable environment amidst the chaos of the world. We will continue our pro-business stance to make sure that our regulations continue to keep pace, if not to lead the innovation required by the new economy. We will make sure that we have superior connectivity, not just in the air, land, and sea dimensions, but also in the areas of data, finance, technology, talent, and regulations. We'll make sure that our tripartite stable relationship, labor management relationship, continues to be a strength of our economy. So these are all the various things that put us in good stead, and I think such fundamentals will not change. Which then comes to the second part of your question, is that how do we see the structure of the Singapore economy evolving? The ability to attract global multinational players to come to Singapore will remain as one of the key pillars. We will continue to strengthen the growth of our local enterprises, including the small and medium enterprises, and this is why we have recently launched the Scale Up Singapore initiative to help our medium enterprises to keep pace with the demands at a global level. Having said that, we will also want to be a base for the not just the local, but the regional and global startup. And more importantly, for them to scale up in Singapore. So it's not just about startup in Singapore, but it's also about scale up in Singapore. And we have an advantage in this because when people need to scale up, they need the financial and legal syndication. That is where our strength may be. A fourth pillar, which we will increasingly develop, will be the area of professional services. And this will encompass both the digital economy and the financial legal services. Many of the things that you've heard about recently, be it the Singapore Convention, the arbitrations, and the mediations, all that plays to our strength as a trusted hub for the global system. So amidst all the difficulties, we will remain as a trusted and safe harbor for many of the global conglomerates that want to operate in Singapore, and also for the Singapore and regional companies that want to use Singapore as a base to reach out to the rest of the world. Now, last but not least, we must never forget that Singapore is at the center of a very vibrant Asia-Pacific region that stretches from India on one side to China to the other side, and ASEAN just at our backyard. And this will be a tremendous opportunity for people to base their operations out of Singapore and for Singapore companies to reach out to the region and beyond.
Right, so we have a few minutes, and I have a few more questions which are more to do with Singapore as a society. I think the more social agenda, not just the economic. The one question here says, Singapore has an aging population, and it's unfortunately also an ageist society. Unless we can guarantee jobs for all its aging citizens until they're 70, we'll have a challenge. Please comment. There's another question which says, it seems Singapore is shifting its balance towards a welfare state model. Government subsidies increasing and taxes trending up. So essentially looking after the less privileged advantage. I think that's what the gist of that question is going to. Will Singapore continue to have kampong with its growing population, limited spaces? So the people of Singapore as society, how do you see us evolving in the new Singapore? Are we going to be more left of center? Are we going to be more social welfare? Are we going to be more vibrant from the standpoint? Sorry, the third question was around talent, and what are we going to do about upskilling and talent in a digitizing world?
Okay, we don't see longevity as a problem. We see longevity as an opportunity. Our neighbor has
I hope nobody sees longevity as a problem, frankly.
Our neighbor has just single-handedly raised the bar. No, but there's tremendous opportunity when people live longer. The question is this: do we still have a concept of a retirement? You know, when you talk about Society 4.0, if you look at Japan, which is at the forefront of many of these policies to deal with aging, people who want to and can work do so meaningfully beyond the age of 80 even. Now the question is, how do we redesign our jobs to make sure that we make use of the potential of this productive longevity, as we call it? So we don't think that it needs necessarily just be a drag on the economy, but if we do it well, we redesign our jobs, we increase the absorptive capacity for the older workforce, there's tremendous opportunities, especially for the professional services, which is an increasing proportion of the Singapore economy. Those are not manual labor that depends on the strength of the muscles, but those depends on experience and so forth. DBS has been a good example of how jobs have been redesigned to allow more inclusive, to have a more inclusive workforce, including many of the older people in society. So that's one part of it. Now the second part of it is that I've never been too enamored by all the political phrases as to whether we are left of center, right of center, because I'm never really sure where is the center. We just have a very practical way of running our country, which is that we will make sure that we master our resources carefully to take care of people from all walks of life, with priority given to the elders. And that is the reason why when we have a bit more resources, we first and foremost take care of the elderly population through the Pioneer Generation Package and the Medical Generation Package. But in that way, you can also see that actually we have been very fiscally responsible. We do not, in Singapore, we do not make policies that burden the future generation. Any welfare packages that we promise must be funded by the current term of government. And if we decide to have a program that exceeds this term of government, the current government must still nevertheless set aside sufficient funds for the future government. And that's why the Pioneer Generation packages and Pioneer Generation and the Medical Generation packages will not burden the future generation. All the monies required have been set aside for the future generation. Now this is quite different from the rest and many parts of the world. Many parts of the world promise and write blank checks, if you like, and burden the future generations, but we make it a promise to our future generation to never do that, which then comes to the issue of land as well. Many people may think that Singapore is running out of land. That is furthest from the truth. You tune into the Prime Minister's National Day rally message tomorrow, you will see how much more land we have, not just for this generation to paint their dreams, but for the next and future generations to paint their dreams in many more years to come. In the next 10 to 20 years, the entire southern waterfront will be redeveloped. That is a few Ang Mo Kio new towns. In another 20, 30 years, the entire Palembang Air Base will be redeveloped, and the entire eastern part of Singapore will have its height constraint lifted. And that will provide us yet a new canvas to paint on. As we speak, in the northwestern corner of Singapore, the entire Sungai Kadut estate will be redeveloped into a new high-tech agri-tech park. So you can see that for every generation of Singaporean, we never define our success by just how well we do for ourselves. We define our success by how well we enable the next generation to do even better for us. We want to make sure that as we progress and develop for the current generation, we leave behind sufficient space, not just in terms of physical space, but also in terms of fiscal space for the next generation to do even better than us. So I am optimistic. I never believed that Singapore is constrained by our physical size. My dream is that Singapore will go down history as the first small nation state that defied the odds of history, that has to rely on a conventional hinterland to survive. But instead, we will survive with the world as our hinterland.
That's very, very, very inspiring, Minister. We're out of time, but I'm going to ask you the last question because we've got a lot of votes. Now, I'm quite sure this question was put in here by somebody who's got political ambitions in Singapore. Because he spoke about tribal instincts. When will Singapore be ready for an Indian or Malay Prime Minister? I think they added Malay just to create some confusion. What somebody really wants to know is when can there be Prime Minister in this audience?
I don't know. Maybe you will tell me, but I think it'll be sooner than you think.
All right. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me. Minister has been very candid, very frank, and very absorbing as always. Thank you very much for spending time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Chun, for that very inspiring dialogue. Thank you, Piyush.